In the late spring of 1945, as the European war moved toward its exhausted conclusion, a quiet and largely unremarked moment unfolded far from the cheering crowds and the shattered capitals. The date was uncelebrated, the location unmarked on most maps. A secure Allied detention facility in the countryside, orderly and newly constructed, its wire fences still smelling of fresh metal. Here, far from the rubble of cities and the photographs that would later define victory, a group of captured German generals sat at long wooden tables and waited for their evening meal. The war had already decided their fate. Their uniforms had been taken, their insignia removed, their authority rendered symbolic at best. Yet they were not hungry in the way millions across Europe were hungry. They were not cold, nor were they afraid of immediate violence. The silence that surrounded them was not the silence of terror, but of suspension. Outside, guards moved with measured steps. Inside, the clatter of plates echoed faintly against walls scrubbed clean. The men had made a request earlier that day. It was modest, almost instinctive: bread. Plain bread, dark and dense, the kind that had accompanied meals for generations. It was not a demand nor a complaint. It was, perhaps, a reaching backward toward familiarity, toward a rhythm of life that still felt recognizably theirs. Bread meant continuity. Bread meant home. What arrived instead unsettled them. The trays carried steak, thick and carefully prepared. Grilled sandwiches followed, their surfaces marked with deliberate lines, cheese melted between slices of white bread. The smell was unmistakable: fat and heat, abundance, intention. It was the kind of meal that belonged to restaurants, to peacetime kitchens, to places untouched by rationing or siege. For a moment the room did not speak. Some men stared at the plates as if they had been placed there by mistake. This was not cruelty and not kindness in the familiar sense. It was something else entirely, harder to name. The men had not asked for luxury. They had asked for something simple, something known. What they received instead carried with it an unspoken weight. The food was prepared carefully, served without comment, and observed, always observed, by guards whose expressions revealed nothing. Officially this was standard procedure. The captives were high-ranking officers. International law prescribed their treatment. Records would later show compliance, even generosity. But in that moment, seated at narrow tables beneath bare bulbs, the men sensed that something more complicated was unfolding. The meal did not reassure them. It disoriented them. Outside the compound, the world was still counting its dead. Cities lay in fragments. Families searched lists and graves. Victory speeches spoke of justice and order restored. Yet inside this contained space, the reality of defeat took on an unfamiliar shape. There were no blows, no shouted commands. There was only the quiet insistence of civility extended to those who had expected retribution. Some of the men ate quickly, mechanically, eyes down. Others hesitated, cutting their meat into smaller portions than necessary, as if restraint might restore a sense of balance. A few could not finish. The food was too rich, too deliberate, too out of place. It forced an awareness they were unprepared to confront, that their captors were choosing restraint where cruelty might have been easier, and that this choice unsettled the moral order they had carried with them into captivity. The room itself seemed to absorb this tension. The scrape of cutlery echoed longer than it should have. The smell of grilled fat lingered in the air, clinging to uniforms and hair. Outside, the light shifted toward evening, filtering through barred windows and long, pale bands. Time slowed, as if waiting for something to be acknowledged. No speeches were made. No explanations offered. The guards did not meet the prisoners' eyes for long. They, too, were part of an arrangement larger than themselves, following instructions that came from offices far away, from policies shaped by lawyers and diplomats rather than soldiers. Yet even they could sense the strangeness of the moment, that the defeated were being fed not to punish or to humiliate, but to demonstrate something less tangible and more disquieting. This was not mercy as absolution. It was not forgiveness. It was a performance of order in the aftermath of chaos, a quiet assertion that power could afford restraint. And for the men seated at the tables, this realization carried its own weight. To be treated humanely by an enemy was to lose the comfort of imagining oneself solely as a victim of circumstance. It introduced doubt, and with it an uncomfortable clarity. The war had trained them to think in absolutes: command and obedience, victory and loss, friend and foe. But here, in this small, controlled space, those divisions softened. The meal did not reconcile anything. It did not erase responsibility or suffering. Instead, it opened a narrow, unsettling space between expectation and reality, a space in which the men were forced, if only briefly, to confront themselves without the armor of ideology or rank. As the plates were cleared and the guards signaled the end of the meal, the room returned to its earlier stillness. The moment passed without ceremony, absorbed into the routines of captivity. Yet something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The taste of that food, the incongruity of its generosity, lingered in memory long after the cutlery was washed and the tables wiped clean. It was there, in that quiet dissonance, that the story truly began. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was neither harsh nor forgiving. It was simply consistent. The camp woke at the same hour each morning, not to shouted commands but to the muted sounds of doors opening and boots moving along gravel paths. The prisoners rose, washed, dressed in the same uniforms they had worn since their capture. The fabric had softened with repeated laundering, the sharp creases of military presentation long gone. What remained was function, cloth meant to cover, not to signify rank. Breakfast arrived on schedule. Coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz brew most had grown accustomed to during the final years of the war. Bread sliced evenly. Sometimes porridge. The men ate quietly, seated according to no particular hierarchy. Old habits of command persisted in posture and gesture, but the formal structure had dissolved. No one gave orders. No one saluted. Authority existed only as memory. For many, this absence was more difficult to endure than confinement itself. Accustomed to defining themselves through command, they now found their days stripped of decision-making. The routines were imposed, yet benign. There was no obvious cruelty against which to push, no enemy to resist. Instead, there was time, long, unstructured stretches of it, and the persistent awareness of being observed without being threatened. The camp was designed to be efficient rather than punitive. Barracks were heated. Medical inspections were regular. Books were permitted, though carefully selected. Chess sets appeared. Paper and pencils were distributed. Even walks were allowed, under supervision, along a defined perimeter where the landscape revealed little beyond fence and sky. The men moved through these allowances cautiously, as though expecting them to be revoked without warning. Meals remained the most disorienting feature of daily life. Lunches included meat several times a week. Stews were thick, seasoned. Vegetables were fresh. Butter was rationed but present. It was not abundance, but it was stability, and it stood in stark contrast to the scarcity that had defined the final years of the war for most of Europe. Some of the men ate everything placed before them. Others left portions untouched, an unspoken refusal to accept what felt unearned. Conversations during meals rarely addressed the food directly. Instead, they circled around it. A remark about seasoning became a comment on logistics. A discussion of cooking methods slid into recollections of mess halls long abandoned. Slowly, through such detours, the men acknowledged the strangeness of their situation without naming it outright. To do so would have required confronting the larger implications, that their enemies were treating them with a care they had not always extended to others. At night, in the shared rooms, sleep came unevenly. Some lay awake listening to the quiet breathing of others, to the distant sounds of guards changing shifts. Others dreamed of home, or of marches and commands that no longer held meaning. The absence of immediate danger allowed memory to intrude more forcefully. Faces appeared uninvited. Orders given years earlier replayed themselves with new inflections. The mind, no longer occupied with survival, turned inward. One officer, once responsible for entire divisions, began to keep a private journal. He wrote not of battles or strategy but of meals. Of the strange discomfort he felt when served meat by men whose language he barely spoke. He described the way the knife felt heavier in his hand, the way each bite seemed to ask a question he could not answer. He did not write of guilt or remorse, only of unease, of a persistent sense that something essential had been inverted. Others reacted differently. A few embraced the routine with visible relief, adapting quickly, accepting the food, the shelter, the order. They spoke of professionalism, of the obligations of civilized nations toward prisoners. In doing so, they framed their treatment as a continuation of military protocol, a mutual recognition among officers. This interpretation allowed them to preserve a sense of dignity, to situate their captivity within familiar structures. Yet even this rationalization could not fully quiet the underlying tension. For beneath the surface politeness lay an awareness that the roles had shifted irrevocably. The men who now received meals were the same men who had once issued commands that shaped the lives of others. The reversal was not dramatic, it was administrative, procedural, and therefore more unsettling. Power had changed hands without spectacle. The guards, for their part, remained largely inscrutable. Many were young, some barely old enough to shave. They followed instructions carefully, aware that their conduct was observed and recorded. A few allowed themselves small gestures, an extra ladle of soup, a brief exchange of words, but most maintained distance. They too inhabited an ambiguous space, tasked with enforcing rules designed to demonstrate restraint rather than dominance. Occasionally, a guard would look at the men seated before him and seem to hesitate, as if recognizing something familiar or unsettling. Perhaps he had lost family in the war. Perhaps he had not. The point was not spoken. The interaction passed without comment, leaving behind only the faint sense of something withheld. As weeks passed, the initial shock of captivity dulled, replaced by a quieter, more pervasive uncertainty. The men began to mark time not by dates but by routines, meal to meal, inspection to inspection. The outside world receded, becoming abstract. News arrived sporadically, filtered through official channels, stripped of emotion. Victories and defeats were reported with equal detachment. In this controlled environment, the smallest deviations took on exaggerated significance. A missing utensil. A change in menu. A guard who lingered too long. Each deviation was noted, interpreted, discussed. The men searched constantly for meaning, for signs of what lay ahead. The food, in particular, remained a focal point, a daily reminder that their captivity was neither brutal nor benign, but something more ambiguous. One evening, a simple supper was served. Soup, bread, a small portion of meat. No explanation accompanied it. Yet the reduction was immediately noticed. Conversations faltered. Some men ate in silence, others pushed their bowls away. The following day the portions returned to their previous size. No comment was offered. The episode left behind a residue of unease. Demonstrated how easily comfort could be withdrawn, how dependent they had become on the very system they did not control. Over time, the men began to understand that the true weight of their captivity did not lie in physical deprivation, but in this sustained ambiguity. They were neither punished nor forgiven. They were maintained. Federal observed. The experience resisted easy interpretation, forcing each man to confront his own assumptions about justice, power, and the meaning of defeat. In the quiet hours before sleep, some stared at the ceiling and thought of the bread they had asked for on that first day. Not because they still wanted it but because of what the request had represented. A desire for familiarity, for continuity, for a world that made sense. What they had received instead was a lesson in uncertainty, delivered without words. And so the days continued, each resembling the last, marked by meals that were never quite what was expected. The camp became a place where time stretched and meaning thinned, where the most significant exchanges occurred not in grand gestures but in the space between expectation and reality. The men lived within that space, suspended between who they had been and who they were becoming, their understanding of power quietly, irrevocably altered. The camp did not close with an announcement. There was no final gathering, no word spoken to mark an ending. The change came gradually, almost imperceptibly, as though the place itself were being allowed to dissolve rather than conclude. Transfers began quietly. A name removed from a list. A bunk left empty. A chair pushed back and not returned. The routines persisted for a time, continuing out of habit rather than necessity, until even those began to thin and lose their urgency. When the men were eventually moved on, some to other facilities, some toward release, the departure was restrained, procedural. There were no farewells of consequence. Guards maintained their practiced neutrality. The gates opened and closed with the same sound they had always made. What lingered was not drama but an absence, a sense that something unresolved had simply been set aside. Years later, those who had been there struggled to describe the experience in coherent terms. The war itself provided an abundance of language: defeat, surrender, guilt, reconstruction, but the months spent in that particular place resisted easy classification. In memoirs and interviews, the camp appeared only briefly, often reduced to a paragraph or a passing remark. Some described it as orderly. Others called it strange. A few avoided mentioning it altogether. When pressed, they spoke not of fear or hardship, but of confusion. Of a dissonance that lingered long after the physical circumstances had faded. They remembered the food most vividly, not because it had been extraordinary but because it had been unexpected. Meals had become symbols without intention, gestures that carried meanings no one had fully articulated at the time. One former officer recalled, decades later, the sound of cutlery against enamel plates. He could not say why the sound remained with him, only that it did. Another remembered the smell of coffee drifting through the barracks in the early morning, a scent that did not belong to defeat. A third spoke of the way guards avoided eye contact, as if unsure which role they were meant to play. None of these recollections resolved into a clear narrative. They existed instead as fragments, orbiting an experience that resisted explanation. For the guards, memory took a different shape. Some recalled the assignment as uneventful, almost dull. Others admitted quietly that it had unsettled them. They had been trained for conflict, not for restraint. Feeding men who had once commanded armies forced them into a moral space for which they had no preparation. The rules were clear, but their meaning was not. In later years, when asked about the camp, a few guards spoke of a persistent unease they could never fully name. Not guilt exactly. Not pride. Something closer to dislocation. They had expected to feel triumph or righteousness. Instead, they remembered silence, routine, and the strange weight of responsibility that came with treating an enemy humanely. History, in its broader telling, had little use for such ambiguities. The narrative of the war moved swiftly toward reconstruction, toward new alliances and new tensions. The camp became a footnote, a logistical detail in the vast machinery of post-war administration. Its significance was not debated because it was not easily categorized. It did not fit neatly into stories of heroism or atrocity. Yet for those who had passed through it, the memory persisted in subtle ways. It appeared in dreams, in unexpected moments of recall. A certain smell. A particular quality of light. The taste of food that arrived without explanation. These sensations carried with them a quiet disquiet, a reminder of a time when moral boundaries had blurred not through chaos, but through order. The men who had once been prisoners grew old. Some spoke publicly, others remained silent. Many carried the experience privately, unsure how to interpret it even decades later. It did not absolve them, nor did it condemn them. It simply existed, an unresolved chapter that resisted simplification. In the end, the camp left no monument. No plaque marked the place where the fences had stood. The land returned to ordinary use, its past absorbed into the landscape. But the memory endured in those who had lived within its boundaries, shaped not by violence or deprivation, but by a quieter, more unsettling confrontation with humanity itself. The bread they had asked for and the meal they received instead became symbols only in retrospect. At the time, they were merely part of a daily routine. Yet over years, those moments gathered meaning, not because of what they represented politically or morally, but because of how they unsettled certainty. They revealed how easily power could express itself through restraint, and how deeply such restraint could unsettle those accustomed to command. In remembering, there was no final judgment, no resolution that brought comfort. There was only the enduring awareness that in a moment defined by defeat and captivity, the most lasting impression was not of cruelty, but of an unexpected and disquieting restraint. And in that restraint, something essential about the nature of power and of humanity itself remained quietly unresolved.